Revelstoke Museum and Archives with our Brown Bag History Talk for the day. I'm sorry you can't join us in person, but we're doing a remote broadcast. I have a Facebook Live broadcast, and I have an audience of Holly, plus some of the puppets from our puppet show that are here watching me too. We wanted to recognize in these times everybody who is working in healthcare in our community and across Canada. We appreciate all of their efforts. Wanted to acknowledge that we are acknowledge the land, traditions, and culture of the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Silks. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So, Revelstoke's first doctor was Duke of Leach McAlpine. He was born in Scotland in 1836, came to Canada where he was practicing in Ontario for 25 years before heading out west. He was in Medicine Hat, and then came to Revelstoke in 1884 and was the first doctor in town. The town was just being established at that time during the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. He had a practice and a little pharmacy on Front Street. His family came, and it was quite a wild town at the time, and he was concerned about having his young children in the wild construction town. So he actually built a little house on an island in the Columbia River, just close to the west side of the river. The family moved to Vancouver in 1887, and he passed away in 1911 at the age of 75. This is a photograph of him with some of his family, and this is him right here, a rather interesting character by all accounts. It was a few years before Revelstoke had another doctor, and Dr. Ernest McLean came here in 1892, graduated from Queen's University the previous year. At the time that he came to BC, there was a smallpox outbreak underway, and McLean was appointed medical officer for the eastern part of the province, and one of his jobs was to check passengers on trains running between Donald and Revelstoke. He had an office and drugstore set up on Mackenzie Avenue. But Revelstoke didn't have a hospital to speak of until 1897, when Dr. William Boyd McKechnie and his partner, Dr. Jess, opened a hospital at the top of Douglas Street Hill. It was a private hospital. There was no public funding for it there, but this is the hospital was located there. That house is still in existence. Was not in operation as a hospital for too long. He had his sister, Margaret McKechnie, working for him, and also his niece, Mary Merker, who was a qualified nurse, and she was Revelstoke's first nurse. She later married a local businessman, A.E. Kincaid. The hospital was quite small and could only accommodate 15 patients. One of those stories about some of the early patients, there was a young man who had been working as a sawmill worker just south of town and broke his leg. He'd arranged earlier for his fiancée to come into Revelstoke by train, where they would be married and then travel south. But on arriving in town, the young woman found that her fiancé was in hospital, so she arranged for a minister to come and perform the ceremony at his hospital bed. In March of 1901, the Revelstoke Hospital Society was incorporated, and they met in May with the Victorian Order of Nurses. And they had an agreement that the order would subscribe $1,500 towards the hospital, and they would operate it under their auspices, and they would provide nursing staff. And as part of the agreement is that it was to be called the Queen Victoria Cottage Hospital. And that's how this hospital got the name Queen Victoria Hospital, is from that early agreement with the Victorian Order of Nurses. The cornerstone of the hospital was laid in September of 1901, and there was actually a royal visit in town at the time. The Duke and Duchess of Cornwall, who was Lady and Lord Minto, were traveling through, And during that visit, the train was stopped here for some time, and Lady Minto, who was she was the patroness of the Victorian Order of Nurses at the time, and she was the one that laid the cornerstone. The hospital opened in August of 1902. The Revelstoke Herald of August 14th said, "The hospital opened. The hospital was unexpectedly called into requisition last Thursday. 2 accident cases being brought in. Fortunately, Nurse McKinnon, who was sent out by the Victorian Order of Nurses to take charge of the work here, arrived the previous day and was on hand to look after the patients. Nurse McKinnon hails from Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, and comes highly recommended, having had large experience in hospital work. She attended for 3 years a training hospital at Philadelphia, after which she was engaged in the Victorian Order of Nursing work at Hamilton, Ontario. Prior to coming to Revelstoke, Nurse McKinnon operated a small hospital in Assiniboia. The Revelstoke Hospital Society has every reason to congratulate itself on obtaining a nurse of Miss McKinnon's experience." And at that time, they had one other nurse and a cook in the hospital in that first year. This is Elsie McKinnon on the steps of the hospital. She was only in the job for less than a year, because in April of 1903, she married the local CPR superintendent, Thomas Kilpatrick, who was also the chair of the Revelstoke Hospital Board. And he was given some bit of ribbing from the other board members for taking away their nurse, their matron, because at that time married women couldn't continue working, especially in occupations such as nursing. The hospital in 1910 had an addition, a brick addition built onto it, and it was built by the firm of Foote and Pratolini, who built the courthouse and quite a few other business buildings in town. It cost $16,000 to build. By then, there was obviously the hospital was in quite high use, and there was no Medicare at that time. So some of the rate of charges around that time for ordinary cases, special visit was 75 cents, but if you had 2 visits per day, that was $1. If you stayed for overnight, it was $2. 3 days or nights was $6, and they also had a weekly rate of $12 if you were a long-term patient. For maternity cases, the first visit cost $1, and subsequent visits cost 75 cents. Operations cost between $1 to $2. In July of 1908, in her half-year report, the matron at that time reported 43 inpatients, 370 outpatients, 39 dressings, and 182 operations. So in 1910, they built the addition, but then they quickly realized that they needed a new hospital. The current hospital just wasn't adequate for the needs of the community any longer. So this original frame hospital, the cottage hospital, was moved over to the next block where the Legion is now. And in 1918, it became the Great War Veterans Association, which of course later became the Legion. And that building served as the Legion until it burned down in the early 1960s and was replaced by the current building. So in August of 1912, they were constructing a new hospital, and they kept the new 1910 addition and were building the new hospital up against the new addition. So they had a cornerstone laying on August 21st. The stone was laid by Honorable Thomas Taylor of Revelstoke, who was the Minister of Public Works for the provincial government. The building cost $85,000, was built by O.W. Abrahamson. And you can see here, this is from a 1955 fire insurance plan showing the location. And it was built on a bit of an angle because there was a road there called Government Road which angled through. This is the current location of Save On Foods. There's First Street here, and Rokeby and Garden. And so we're Government Road. The last little trace of that is where Lordico Auto Parts is now, where the road angles in, but it angled all the way through. Originally it angled all the way through to 3rd Street, but that was the location of the hospital. You can see it kind of fronted on Government Road at first. In this plan you can see the 1910 addition, and that shows how they built the new hospital up against the addition, and behind was the nurses' residence. You can see the beginning of the construction there, and the nurses' residence is behind, and that later became a nurses' training school as well. And you can see there how it's being built up to incorporate the 1910 brick addition. And construction is continuing well. The scaffolding is moving up there. And finally, the hospital was opened on June 18th, 1913. They had what they called an at-home that was hosted by the Ladies' Hospital Auxiliary. And the Ladies' Auxiliary had been formed in 1901 as well, when the hospital board was formed. And it was there, they did a lot of the fundraising. And in the early days, the hospital was kind of furnished locally. So the Ladies' Auxiliary were the ones that made sure that there was bed linens and all the other furnishings. They had usually every now and then they would have what they called pantry showers. So people would bring goods for canned goods and other items and jams and jellies for the kitchen of the hospital. It was very much community supported. There were no hospital authorities at that time. Any hospitals were organized just by the community. And Revelstoke, as well as the Revelstoke Hospital, they actually also started a hospital in Arrowhead that operated for a few years in the early 1900s. And they also operated the first hospital at Chase. And part of that is because they had an agreement with a lot of the lumber companies for care of the lumber company workers. And there was one of the big lumber companies at Chase also had their head offices in Revelstoke. So they actually made an agreement that they would provide hospital services for the Chase as well. The first matron of the hospital was Jean Matheson. Unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of her, but she was quite an interesting woman. She came here in 1912 during the construction of the new hospital. And in 1915, she signed up as a nurse for overseas duty during World War I. She was actually decorated by King George V for her work during the war. And she had charge of a clearing hospital in Liverpool until the close of the war, and was later appointed matron of the Shaughnessy Hospital in Vancouver. And she held that position until just a year before her death in 1938. But she was responsible for starting the nurses' training school here. Their first class graduated in 1917, and the second class seen here graduated in 1918. In 1921, Amy Smythe was the first Revelstoke-born nurse to graduate here. And the training school closed in 1935. There were quite a few local women who took their nurse training here. One of the women who started her training here was Jean Kwong, who was born in Revelstoke to one of the pioneer Chinese families here, Wong and Yvonne Kwong. And she actually started her training here, but they closed the school, and she completed it at the Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster. And she was the first woman of Chinese ancestry to graduate as a nurse in Canada. She actually broke a bit of a barrier, race barrier, with her graduation. and two of her sisters also graduated as nurses in later years. This photograph, we have Dr. Hamilton and Dr. Sutherland. They were kind of the really well-known doctors here for many, many years. Dr. Sutherland was born in Prince Edward Island in 1876 and was house surgeon at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal. He came here in 1903 as the superintendent of the Cottage Hospital, and he was mayor of Revelstoke in 1912 and elected as an MLA in 1916. He served in the BC government for quite a few terms. He moved to Vancouver in the 1930s as a resident doctor at the CPR Hotel in Victoria. And Dr. Hamilton, on this side, was born in Ontario in 1882. His father was actually a CPR telegraph operator and dispatcher in Revelstoke and then in Nelson. Dr. Hamilton was the first hospital at the, or first doctor at the Alexandria Hospital in Arrowhead, and in 1906 came to Revelstoke. And he worked here as a doctor until his death in 1938. During the First World War, he served overseas as the medical officer with the 54th Kootenai Battalion. He was really a well-known local doctor. He was the one that was really responsible for taking control of the bans and the public health during the 1918 flu epidemic. A couple more pictures of some of the local nurses. And this was Nurse Vera Nelson, later Vera Turnross, with a young patient. And a couple of the nurses joking around with the skeleton, probably a mannequin used for practice. The first ambulance was, motorized ambulance for the hospital was purchased in 1920. And this is a later ambulance driven by Joe Farmelo, who's a well-known local driver. There was an isolation hospital built in 1922 on what's now the corner of the parking lot of Save on Foods and the Alpine Village Mall. And wasn't in operation for very long, and it later became a private home and was moved to 3rd Street West down in the lower part of town, and is still there as a private home. So the hospital was in use for many years. You can see here a photograph of it along Government Road and the cenotaph in its original location. In the 1960s, there was real concern that the hospital was too old, it was too small, the equipment was outdated, and that Revelstoke needed a new hospital. And a few people disagreed about that, but there was real concern about where it was going to be built. They felt that there wasn't enough space on the current property to build a hospital of the size that was needed for the community. And there wasn't a lot of other available space downtown. One of the lots they did look at was where the community center is now. But that wasn't, there was some problems in acquiring that land. The area that we now know as Arrow Heights was just opening up at that time, and there was a lot of land available there. So there was a decision made to build the hospital on land in Arrow Heights. But that wasn't without its controversy, because it was actually outside of city limits at that time. Revelstoke city limit just went as far as Downey Street. So it was actually in the regional district. But there was a big push. There was lots of information put out in the newsletter, in the local newspapers. There were ads purchased by the committee against the new hospital at the Arrow Heights location, and there was big ads purchased by the Hospital Society in favor of the new location. So it actually kind of divided the community in a way. There was people taking sides over the location of the hospital. But the big thing was there was still, even in the 60s, there was a lot of people who didn't have independent transportation. There was a big concern about it being outside and not as accessible in a downtown location. But it became clear that the only way that Revelstoke would get a new hospital is if they accepted the new location. And so finally they had the bylaw and agreed that the voters agreed to the location in Arrow Heights. That was actually quite high vote in favor of the new location. When they were doing the campaign, they were showing these pictures that I just showed you of the conditions in the older hospital and contrasting that with pictures of what the new hospital would look like. So there was certainly making the case that we were really in need of a new hospital. These were some of the doctors who were in here at the time. So Dr. Henry Eric Hamer, and was in Revelstoke for quite a while. He settled in Revelstoke in 1941. He joined the Medical Corps of the Royal Canadian Army and was stationed in the Aleutian Islands between 1942 and 1946, and returned to Revelstoke after the war and practiced here until 1974. Dr. Hugh Mackay was also really well known locally, and as well as being a doctor, he was very involved in the ski club and a lot of other local organizations, including the organization that's now Revelstoke Museum and Archives Association. He came to Revelstoke in 1949 and practiced here until 1969. And he actually left over the decision to relocate the hospital. He wasn't happy with that decision and left at that time. This is Dr. Armstrong, who was also very well known in Revelstoke for quite some years, mostly in the 50s and 60s. So in September 28th, 1968, the sod turning ceremony was held for the new Queen Victoria Hospital. These were former nurses from Revelstoke and former graduates of the old training school, Vera Benison, Muriel Robinson, and Ella Connolly. And they're joining Frank Prail, who is the hospital board chairman, for the sod turning. And the new Queen Victoria Hospital opened on December 19th, 1970. These are some of the doctors that were prominent here in when the new hospital opened. Dr. Tom Taylor, who later moved to Kelowna, and Dr. Mark Longhurst, who died quite young, unfortunately, and Dr. Battersby, who many people will remember. A few years ago, Dr. Battersby was awarded the Order of Canada for his work in Revelstoke and in the province for community support. He was our mayor for a couple of terms as well. As I mentioned, the hospital auxiliary was started in 1901, and at the time it was called the Women's Hospital Auxiliary because women couldn't sit on boards then, but a way for them to be involved was to start an auxiliary to a board. So they've spent, since 1901, have been very active in this community, and with their thrift store, they continue to raise money for health needs of the community, donating more than $193,000 in 2018. Unfortunately, the thrift shop is closed just at the moment, but I know there's a lot of people anxiously waiting for its reopening. The Mount Cartier Court Residential Care Facility opened in 2006, and an addition was built on in 2007. And the most recent addition at the hospital was the opening of the helipad in October of 2018. So we're certainly thankful of the healthcare that we enjoy in this community, and appreciate the doctors and nurses that we have, and so we'd like to thank them and acknowledge them during the current health emergency in BC. And thank you for joining us this afternoon.